Yep. Live.
Hello, here are the office hours, and I'll begin by not just welcoming students, but thanking you, the people who have undertaken to do this Art of Poetry course have made it a very satisfying experience for me and for the great helpers I have too. So, thank you, and as to questions, fire away. I'll be reading them off my screen, and I will be answering them right into that camera. I know last time my super microphone wasn't integrated so that I was just moving my lips for the first few minutes. I'm pretty confident that that will not happen again.
All right. Show something coming through soon.
Typing is happening. I feel like I should be doing shadow puppets or something while we wait, but we'll be there soon. When I was a kid, there was a radio show called The Answer Man. And he would answer questions on the radio. He was the Google of his day. Here is a question from the forum. D18 asks, have translators turned poor or good originals into good or great translations? How much license does a translator have, especially today, to construct his own poem? Is whether the original poet's living or not an issue? It was certainly an issue for me in dealing with Czesław Miłosz when Robert Hass and I did those Miłosz translations. I can remember we were going to meet with Czesław and Renata Gorczynski, and Renata said, Czesław won't make it today. He has to have lunch with his Korean translators. And Bob and I chuckled, and Renata said, why are you laughing? And we explained we envied his Korean translators. Czesław's English was quite good, and he had his opinions. I'm pretty sure I can quote this little poem from memory by Tom Gunn. It's a little epigram on the subject of whether the translation is sometimes better than the original. I'm looking through my personal anthology to see if I have it here. I think I can do it. And readings from the French, one of Tom's poems is, all are unmasked as perverts sooner or later. This is about Proust. All are unmasked as perverts sooner or later, with one notable exception, the narrator. Another one is something like, the prose of Edgar Poe, which is how the French, like Baudelaire, pronounce Poe's name. The prose of Edgar Poe, the lucid prose of Edgar Poe, just and rhetorical, without exertion, loses all lucidity, God knows, in the single, poorly rendered English version. It's Tom a bit taking the mickey out of Tom Gunn taking the mickey out of Poe and suggesting that Poe is actually a better poet in French than he is in English. That's the only example I can think of that. I'm a living poet. I recently had my poems come out in Spanish translation, and before that in Italian, languages I know a bit. And I think partly from dealing with Czesław, I'm inclined to be trusting that once a person is doing a translation, the poet might as well give the person for whom the language is a mother tongue right to do what they want. God knows there are good translations and bad translations. And a poet so important to American poetry, such a great poet as Pablo Neruda, the more the merrier. Same for Rilke. Each time we get another translation, something is added. And my Inferno, I feel that that translation is the quickest, uses the fewest words. It's not impossible that somebody will do something else better than I do it. So free to construct your own poem. People do that. Robert Lowell published a book called Imitations, which acknowledges that his versions of Leopardi or Rimbaud or whoever he's doing are pretty far from literal. Let's just fall back on that term, literal. Here's another question from the discussion forum. The discussion forum is less interesting. From the discussion forum, 314 Pi asks, are there more general standards than personal feelings to use to recognize the significance of a poem? If there are standards, are they culturally bound? Do more than peer pressure, etc. We can ask the same question about judgment of what is a good, what is a poor, what is a great hamburger, what is a good, what is a great or a poor pair of pants, or TV show, or how great a comic is this comic compared to that one. Of course, there are cultural elements. Of course, all such judgments are partly personal, but in music, in cuisine, in sports, in poetry, the more you know about the thing, the more there are moments when you say, that was truly great, or that was inadequate. So I would, as I have often suggested, it's good to think about the way poetry is different from other kinds of language and other arts. There are also things it shares with other uses of language and other arts. And the significance, in the sense not of the meaning, but the importance or greatness of a poem. Emily Dickinson said it makes feel like the top of your head is coming off. I read Sailing to Byzantium or At the Fish Houses. I feel that way, and I'm pretty confident in it, even though I acknowledge there are cultural elements that make me receptive to unless Saul clap its hands and sing and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Mortal dress has to do with attitudes that my culture has about clothing, about death, the way in which the poem is not particularly religious, satisfies a whole set of cultural attitudes of mine. So I can acknowledge that culture plays a role, but also when I read Sailing to Byzantium, I know it's pretty great. When I read a poem in a magazine that was written a few months ago, and I can see that it has a lot of imagination, that it's very interested in using idiom in an interesting way, but it has no charm for the ear. It lacks intonation. It lacks any interest of that kind. I've been around a while. As the old cliche goes, I've sold papers in this block for some time, and I feel like I know the difference. Here's a question. That question continues. What might it mean if one does not share the general assessment of the significance of a poem? I think it's an indication that you're a grown-up. You will, if you agree with absolutely every general cultural judgment you receive, you're probably not exerting a mature sense of your own judgment and your own aesthetic. There's always something that you don't like, that other people think is wonderful. I tend to be, I'm kind of deaf to Byron. every so often I'll read a sestina by somebody like Elizabeth Bishop, and I'll admit it's a good poem, but I'm a bit sestina deaf. So I think it's a good poem. Happens to be a sestina. They could have had the sestina-ishness and not followed the rules. I would have been just as happy with it. So we all have predilections and tendencies, and to have them and feel them, to feel their force and acknowledge their force, to me is part of being a serious person. I use the expression grown up not to say anything deprecatory about children. Some of my best friends are children. The same question about translation, the reverse. How many great poems have been rendered forgettable in translation? I mentioned Byron. There appears never to have been an English translation of the great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin that really works very well in English. And people who know Russian or learn Russian assure us that Pushkin is a very, very great poet. As far as I know, that hasn't been demonstrated in English yet. Pushkin in translation is a kind of long drink of water.
So the question from Focus Driver?
Focus Driver, where's the beginning of your question? Here it is. Focus Driver asks, would John Keats have written on opening Chapman's Homer if he had been able to read the original? Would we enjoy the King James's Bible and all its beauty if we had been forced, as the church would have preferred at the time, to rely on our local priest reading to us in Latin and explaining the plot? Keats, I have to think, would have written a different great poem if he could read Homer in Greek and if he had read it as a child, as some of the more affluent contemporaries he had did. They had the pleasure of reading Homer in the original, as Keats did not. They had the pleasure of reading him when they were very young, as Keats did not. Keats had the pleasure of writing a truly great poem. If we only heard explanations of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, if we only knew those, it gets very complicated about the Vulgate. If we only knew them in Latin, let alone Aramaic or whatever you think of as the core, we would lose a lot. I think the King James is a great example of the opposite of the Pushkin principle. The King James is a translation that is a wonderful work of art. I'll confess I'm kind of addicted to it. I know there are modern translations that are more accurate, and I consult them. But I love 16th century poetry, and when I read that 16th century prose that influenced the writers I love, the King James influenced not only Emily Dickinson, it influenced William Faulkner and countless writers, just about every American Protestant writer. I'm sure it influenced Scott Fitzgerald. I know that it influenced Willa Cather. So a whole cultural presence in that translation is quite valuable to me. And it is fun to think, as this question does, about how Keats might have written differently or understood differently, how we might understand differently without these translations. There are two examples of a translation being much appreciated. Chapman by Keats in that poem, and the King James Bible by a long list of writers, including American writers, in both translations that had good effects. And here's a question. What would I do differently if I were doing the course over again? I think it may well happen again. And the course creators, Dwan and I, both feel we would probably try to have as little apparatus as possible. Reduce the amount of platforming and formatting, and try to make, certainly retain the discussion, but try to make everything as simple and available as possible would be my my impulse and what I'll try to do. Holly King wants me to give some suggestions about how to talk about poems that we love. She says, I find myself fumbling for language, writing paragraphs, and failing to capture why it succeeds. Writing about works of art is hard to do. There's a journalist in art here in Boston, Sebastian Smee, who writes for the Boston Globe. I'm amazed every time I read one of his very short pieces about a specific work of art you can see in a New England museum, mostly New England museums. He has the knack for doing it. And I hope I learn a little from him. I couldn't tell you how or why. The way I think I learned when I was first writing book reviews in my 20s, I tried to learn from George Bernard Shaw's music reviews, which he wrote for newspapers professionally, and Max Beerbohm's theater reviews, just for the wit and compression and the liveliness. I feel like if you, I certainly didn't see those plays, I didn't know a lot of the music. It's done so well that you're interested anyway. And now I would say I try to read about reviews of rock and roll and hip hop and pop music in the New Yorker. They always seem so pretentious, so complicated that I work at it. It feels hard for me. I'd contrast that with what Sebastian Smee does. So I take the question seriously, Holly King. I'm not trying to totally avoid it. But all I can suggest is to find models that you think work for you. One thing is the art of quoting well. Writing about poetry often is a matter of quoting effectively. I think Pound does that well in ABC of Reading. My teacher, Ivor Winters, is a brilliant quoter. T.S. Eliot, in his essays, often quotes well. And the quotation can help inspire you. You type it out indented or in quotes in your piece that you're writing, and the quotation tells you how to describe it. So in a way, choosing what to quote might be sometimes a first step to finding out how to talk about a poem you love. It's a good question. It doesn't have any real answer. But I'd say finding models and using quotations. Best I can do, Holly.
Hey, Robert, can you check your mic if you selected?
I hope my mic is working. The question has come up.
I mean, it's been going.
Yeah.
I just had a question about an
Echo.
Is it selected?
Excuse me while I make sure that my mic is selected for one person talking, not for a whole room. Yeah, I have it at number 1. Those of you who are getting an echo, I'm sorry. But I have a feeling I'm not going to be able to correct it. Or maybe I will. Here comes another question. You're getting a lot of alert, puzzled faces. Best I can do is show you those faces. Is one coming?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
Believe me, someone is typing. My course creator and friend Zui Duan is typing away furiously to get the question to appear so I can answer it.
Should be there.
I don't see it. Should I refresh? Aha! Here it is. From YouTube, F. Henderson asks, music, which is frequently considered, quote, great, end quote, is usually complex or orchestral. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, Strauss's The Spoke Zarathustra, further back Beethoven's symphonies or Bach fugues. Uh, these works were not, I'm waiting for the rest of the question. I wonder about being considered great, complex or orchestral. Aren't there great, I mean, string quartets, sonatas? Um, I haven't read an immense amount of music criticism, but I see what you mean about orchestral. But I think sometimes sonata, certainly concerto for instrument, or works like the Brahms Clarinet Quintet, certainly people say is one of the great works ever written for that instrument. These works were not easy, Henderson continues, on the ears of their contemporaries. Is great poetry the same? Does time work in favor of complex poetry? I think it works both ways. When I was in my 30s, hundreds of years ago, I think Ezra Pound's cantos were approached with more credulity. People subscribed to the idea of the cantos as a great work more readily. And I think the complexity of that project has come to seem more and more a little inchoate to people. On the other hand, Wallace Stevens, who once seemed extremely difficult, has increasingly seemed, once we know what the Stevens gestures are, to do with the relation between aesthetics and a quasi-religious conviction, the connection between meaning as created and meaning as discovered. Once those themes become not only familiar in themselves, but familiar as generated in the Stevens way, the complexity of Stevens has tended, maybe there is an analogy with Stravinsky here, it's become not domesticated, but more fully understood, and it does seem more relished. Pound, perhaps the opposite. So I think time tends to work in favor of complexity, but there's something that runs out too. I suppose that Finnegan's Wake has gained as the writing. I think we can say that Gertrude Stein would be among the writers whose complexity has benefited from time. Again, maybe opposite process of Pound. Anyway, F. Henderson raises a really interesting question. Somebody who knows more about classical music than I do could tell me whether Schoenberg and 12-tone music has not benefited, that complexity perhaps has attracted more skepticism. These are difficult questions, and questions, frankly, kind of beyond my scholarship and my understanding. But it's an interesting way to think about time in relation to aesthetic attitudes. I suppose over the years, many, many things come in and out of approval. I have, for some reason, been in a jag of reading Dickens. I read one of the first authors I read Our Mutual Friend for probably the third or fourth, maybe fifth time in my life. Certainly I've read in it a lot. I read it right through, and it was so pleasurable that I then read Dombey and Sons, aware all the time that Dickens's often a lack of complexity, a willingness to strike very obvious notes very beautifully harmonized, and sort of unembarrassed refrain and repetition, and very broad strokes of character. I loved it. And there was probably a time when Dickens by sophisticated academic critics. He isn't really so good on social questions and the sort of complex way where you deconstruct Dickens and say, well, really his complaints about the poor laws were blah, 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 blah. I read it and thought, no, you go, man. The poor laws were terrible. And the pomposity and the self-satisfaction of the capitalist Dombey is repellent. And it's satisfying to see the long novel corrected. So I guess my answer to F. Henderson is yes and no. And here comes another question. I feel like I should have chamber music or something between when the questions appear. I guess I have an experienced teacher's and probably a certain kind of person's dread of silence, but still, I will wait quietly for the question.
One should be on the way.
It is on the way. Electronics is slower than if we were all in a room together. Go figure. Would it help if I refresh?
No, that shouldn't
Okay.
be the issue.
Here it comes.
Just some of them are instant.
Hmm?
Some of them go up right away. I mean, I have it here.
If we do the course again, I will look into snappy ways to do it that feels to me like a very good idea at this live office hours. And this time I managed to be audible. Maybe next time we'll have the questions stacked up and I'll do them in a snappy way. What do you think Bishop's poem Filling Station? Why do you think Bishop's poem Filling Station caused such a polarization of interpretation? Do you think Bishop intended that effect? There's a very familiar divergence of the feeling of the artist and the feeling of the student toward a work of art, perhaps especially poetry. Elizabeth Bishop, I believe, was not thinking about the correct or incorrect interpretation of her poem. She was hoping you would think it was a terrific, wonderful poem. The poet is in the position, I've said before, of somebody who cooks a meal for you. Or I brewed beer for you. I knitted you a sweater. I carved you a little object out of wood and I'm giving it to you. I'm not interested in your idea of what it means, maybe in a tertiary way, but primarily I want you to say, this is the kind of food I like. This sweater is very pleasing to me. This beer is delicious. You gave a great party. So Bishop would perhaps be impatient with opinions, arguments about what she intended. In a certain way, it's an insult to the artist. What were you trying to say? She was an extremely articulate writer and person, and she said what she meant to say. I think that divergence between an interest in just the work of art being attractive, moving, engaging, something you want to go back and back to many times. Secondary thing is, yes, I would like you to think about it a lot, Elizabeth might say. Yes, I would like you to discuss it with someone else and find things in it that are not immediately apparent. That's secondary. Primary is, it gave you what you seek in a work of art. And tertiary is, do I have it right? So it's hard to predict when any group of people will suddenly find themselves arguing about the meaning of a poem or film. I last summer I showed I think a great film, uh, Jeremy Seduced and Abandoned, to an audience at a writers' conference, and I think most people agreed with me that it was a great film, uh, showing appalling uh, oppression of women, this particular young woman in particular. But I was startled to find there was one or two people thought this is an awful movie. It shows terrible things. Uh, Art doesn't require unanimity to be successful. Um, then Arhava goes on. Uh, isn't it like the early adopters of technology, where this is part of that Carol Stephen question. Isn't it like the early adopters of technology, where some accept it easily and quickly, while the rest take time to come to it? Of course, with technology, there's also the factor that as it refines, it becomes more immediately usable. So you used to have to know a lot about cars to drive a car. You advance the spark, you pull out the choke. Even in my day, you used to pull out the choke to help it start. Same with music. People used to feel they needed to know a lot about what they would call their stereo system or their hi-fi. Uh, some fanatics are going back to that, but generally, the longer as a technology is refined, it has a more immediate. I suppose the idea is user-friendly. Uh, Poetry, music, Stravinsky, Stevens, or Pound, uh, the analogy may break down a bit there. The refinement may take place in us, the audience, where we become more skeptical, perhaps, of the cantos, more understanding, perhaps, of Sunday morning. And that's a process that is a cultural process. From the forum, the recluse says poetry can be taught, techniques can be taught, but is there a way to teach a person how to become a poet? The gift is partly innate, but it also can be developed. Can you teach a person how to become a dancer, an athlete, a basketball player, a tennis player? If by a tennis player you mean Venus Williams, perhaps not, although that dad spent a lot of time teaching those kids, and those kids had very good teachers when they were young. Uh, Presumably, they also had something in them that was just terrific. Pope Alexander Pope had a father who was determined that Pope would have a tremendously good education, and I think pretty early on, an education as a poet. Um, to me, I see a lot of young poets. I used to see a lot of undergraduates. I still see a lot of graduate ones. I was at a high school today. The sign that a person will become a poet or has become a poet is less in the writing than in the passion for the reading. The person who has that in them to be a poet will be attached to something. It may not be something that I like, but I see in that person the ardent attachment to the work of art. For me, it involved Allen Ginsberg, William Butler Yeats, Emily Dickinson, Alan Dugan, the things I read when I was young. I feel like I became a poet through my obsessive immersion in poetry. And that perhaps is more reliable than how good is the writing when a person is a teenager. Keats, by the time he was 27, 26, whoever it was, he died. His very first efforts are not so good. He quickly became just great. Yeats wrote his greatest poems after his late 50s. Having studied the masters, continues the recluse, and learned from them, are you aware of any current poetry magazines that publishes poetry that resembles anything produced by the masters? It's always instructive to look at very old issues of magazines. So if you look at old issues of Poetry magazine, you'll see The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. You'll see Sunday Morning. It stanzas in a different order that the editor insisted on. You'll also see a lot of things that at the time seemed plausible and that are not impressive now. I have a lot of respect for the Threepenny Review, edited by Wendy Lesser. I have a lot of respect for Salmagundi, edited by Robert Boyers and Peg Boyers. I have a realistic sense, having been an editor. I was a poetry editor at Slate. I was a poetry editor at New Republic. I've done it for years. I think to do it, you have to understand that you will make mistakes. You will reject things that later you'll realize were very, very good, and you'll publish things that later you'll think, really, why did I like that so much? You try to have the best batting average you can. And since you ask, I will mention Threepenny Review and Salmagundi, where I find the batting average pretty good. And I'm proud of the poems that I published in Slate as an online magazine. Those poems are still, you can still check me out and decide how good my taste was in all those years that I did Slate. I don't think the New Republic is online. From the forum, poetess Denise says, coming in loud and clear, great questions and answers. Thank you, Denise. I'm glad to hear the echo is not too bad. Will there be more opportunity in the second class to share our own poetry with the students? I think we might look into having a separate forum where people from any iteration of this course can share poems with one another. That seems it should be easy enough to generate, and maybe even be generated by students within the class. Fotini80 asks, going back to the issue of rules/no rules and how they apply in poetry, how should a non-experienced poet approach this when writing? For example, should the selection of a form be a deliberate choice when writing a poem? I guess I don't think of it as a selection of a form so much as the discovery or invention or creation of a form. So for me, and everybody is different, for me, it's not saying I'll try to write a sonnet or a villanelle or a poem in rhyme royal or tercets. For me, it would be more, I'd like to write a poem where the length of the line and the length of the stanza varies a lot, and a lot of varying repetition of a word. That is, the word in different meanings in different parts of speech is kind of buried, becomes an underground river in the poem. Or I'd like to write a poem that is in the short lines of a poem like Campion's Now Winter Nights Enlarge, or Frost's To Earthward, Love of the Lips whose touch as sweet as I could bear. Now winter nights enlarge the number of their hours. I'd like to write a poem like that that has that kind of grace and short lines, but it's not in rhyme and not iambic. So I'm trying to come as close as I can to giving myself an assignment where what I'm really convinced of is Yeats said, I get a tune in my head. So it isn't so much the deliberate choice of a form as a determination to achieve the quality of form, to have something feel right. Fotina80 goes on, if so, doesn't that hinder or limit the writing process? For many people, yes. Probably for some, not. There might be people who get a lot out of, as I do not, of writing, trying to write a sestina in iambic pentameter, or writing acrostic poems. double sonnets. You never know what might help generate a work of art for a particular person. Uh, for me, it's hindering to feel that there's a form that is, I've used the word pejoratively, a recipe. And I guess by using that word in a slightly pejorative sense, I've been trying to imply that the good cook improvises, may have a recipe as a guide or an alternative, but something new happens. The best cook generates something new. Um, F. Henderson asks, why does it seem that poetry is separate from the other literary arts? For instance, you say in singing school that Thomas Hardy is unusual for being both a novelist and a poet. Probably what I say about that being unusual probably possibly applies more to contemporary writing, but I immediately think of exceptions. Margaret Atwood has written wonderful poems and great fiction. I think for many generations, you did both. There also may be an American, I'm happy to say fading, an American feeling. I'll reveal a little prejudice. I think it used to be common among specifically male fiction writers. I used to hear, I don't think I hear as much as I used to. I don't get poetry, I don't know poetry. I think it's part of an American vestigial embarrassment about culture, particularly high culture. I mean, Hemingway wrote poems, but in a Hemingway-esque way. There may have been a time when the American fiction writer's desire to have a mainstream quality may have, but Updike, I can remember publishing poems by John Updike in the New Republic, possibly in Slate as well. Russell Banks started as a poet. It may be that in the 19th century, people like the Bronte sisters, it seemed more natural to write a poem as well as to write fiction. Miłosz wrote a novel because there's a prize for a European novel and he needed the money. So he wrote one. As I have read it in translation, as I recall, it's pretty good. I mentioned our lack of good translation of Pushkin. I don't think Nabokov's attempts turned out so well. Though in Pale Fire, he demonstrates that he can write something a lot like poetry. From the forum, Calarode asks, do you think it's possible for a listener to be narcissistic and empathetic? No one listens to what everyone has to say. No one. Even those most charged with the responsibility of doing so. Not a criticism, just a query. Would it be nice to think that somewhere for some of us, the impulse to be like Narcissus and to admire one's reflection in a pool becomes a respect for the other. The other person is not a reflecting pool. The other person answers back. There's that wonderful poem by Frost, the most of it. He thought he kept the universe alone, for all the voice and answer he could wake was but the mocking echo of his own from some tree-hidden cliff across the lake. Some morning from the boulder-broken beach, he would cry out on life that what it wants is not its own love back in copy speech, but counter-love, original response. And there, the somewhat narcissistic writer Frost presents what I take to be himself as a character who says that what life wants is not its own love back in and copy speech, but counter love, original response, which is a paradox. An origin is not a response, but we desire it. And I don't want to seem smarmily affirmative or nice in the worst sense, but though no one listens to what everyone has to say, my experience is that some people do listen to what some people have to say. And that's a profound need that Frost's poem mocks and elaborates and makes penetrating. Nothing ever came of what he cried unless it was the embodiment that crashed in the cliff's talus on the other side, and then in the far distant water splashed. But after a time allowed her to swim, instead of proving human when it neared, and someone else additional to him, as a great buck it powerfully appeared, pushing the crumpled water up ahead, and landed pouring like a waterfall, and stumbled up the rocks with horny tread, and forced the underbrush, and that was all. That enviable line, even if you don't like Frost, you have to say, pushing the crumpled water up ahead is awfully good for that animal swimming across the water. And I'll strain a little bit to connect that with Narcissus staring into his pool. One listens to pushing the crumpled water up ahead. It's like moments in music or in dance when you'd have to be insanely narcissistic not to attend to a certain kind of accomplishment that is more than an echo, but does involve empathy. What a nice contribution there, Colorado. I was glad to read that from you. Is it better, says, I think this is Carol Stephen, is it better to approach poetry from the early poets in stages as you recommend for Marvell's Appleton House? I found it hard to stay with it for more than 10 segments at a time. It was kind of a prank for me to put, I love Upon Appleton House. I love Marvell. I think that poem is superb, and it is a challenge to y'all and to readers. So you read it 10 segments at a time. Sounds like fun. And in a way, you can feel good about yourself when you realize, I actually can enjoy this. This poem is diverting. You can picture him reading it to the audience at the country house. And though it's no longer an inside joke, and I have it available to me to play any of 50 video games or to watch any of 1,000 movies on Netflix, I want to be doing this. Upon Appleton House does something really terrific. And it's a long poem. I think of Sam Johnson saying about Paradise Lost, nobody ever wished it were longer. I can have a good time reading 2 or 3 pages of Paradise Lost and just relishing the verse and the music and the sophistication of the feeling. It's why people still read epics. We don't read them because you don't read the Odyssey because it's good for you or everybody says you're supposed to. There's something great about it. And I would say less old poems than long poems. I wonder if anybody sits down with A.R. Emmons' Garbage and reads it right through. Long poem doesn't have to be read at one sitting any more than a novel is. I said earlier that for years I would read a chapter or two, sometimes just the first chapter of Our Mutual Friend, before I decided it'd be fun to read the whole thing again. I read Ulysses that way. I pick up Ulysses as though it were a book of poems. I pick it up the way I pick up the collected poems of William Butler Yeats and read something. I have read it right through, but it's fun to just play in the rooms as one plays in the rooms of Upon Appleton House. Fotene Calogregoriani says, I enjoy participating in the seminar. First time I read American poetry. I noticed a connection with ancient Greek poetry. How does this connection affect an American poet? Just mentioned the Odyssey. It's an absolutely fundamental work of art. And Americans are sensitive to the idea of leaving home and possibly coming back to home. And Telemachus, it's a good idea for Telemachus to go out and come back, even though that mirror of what his father does is not especially functional to the plot. It's part of what you do if you are a maritime commercial culture. You do that. I think Konstantin Kavafi, as it's comparable to Rilke and Neruda in the effect he's had on American poetry. We're always, probably in every culture, certainly in the culture I grew up in, there's always the danger of provinciality and being closed, and work in other languages can relieve and ameliorate that risk. Melanie Walker in the forum, what advice do you give to poets interested in finding a mentor, someone more experienced, such as yourself? It's not easy. As much as possible, as the anthology assignment in this course indicates, I encourage you to study with Elizabeth Bishop and William Butler Yeats. Study with Ben Jonson. A little bit easy for me to say. I had the privilege of studying with Francis Ferguson and Ivor Winters. I will say about the word mentor, I've never thought of those people that way. I like the word teacher. And depending on where you live, there are people are in a way you need to find someone whose work you admire, study it hard, know it very well, and then at some point feel, well, now I understand what she has, that mentor. I understand what she is trying to give to the world. So it was permissible for me to, in effect, present my credentials to her and say, this is what I've learned from your work. Would you be willing to look at a page or two of mine and tell me how I'm doing? Might not work, but it's a thought. It's the best I can do right now, Melanie. What is lost or gained if one only hears a poem read and does not see the text? Should we assume that poetry now is meant to be read, attending to the form? Form is not read, form comes in here, more than heard. For me, it's a vocal art. The graphics, we see a lot of graphics all day in our tablets and computers and magazines. And for me, eventually I would like to be able to read the poem slowly, say it slowly. That's the advantage of having it in print. But what's lost if I don't imagine saying the poem is large for me. For me, my pleasure in poetry and my work as a reader is to imagine what would it feel like to need to say, he thought he kept the universe alone. Or, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And when I say imagine saying it, I mean imagine my breath and the muscles in my mouth and my voice box saying, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Or that is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. For me, the sensory impact is in the hearing, and the notation, as in music, can be a great help. The page, the sheet music, or the poem printed out so I can see Yeats's rhyme scheme or the nature of Bishop's form. It's a great help. But the essential action is imagining what it feels like to say this and to need to say it in a way that's more precisely what I'm interested in than just saying, oh, read it aloud. Imagine saying it is how, for me, is how to read a poem. Kay asks from the forum, to say a poem, quote, resists colonization, wonderful phrase that caught on so much that was just spontaneously said by a man named Calvin Olson. in one of the discussions. To say a poem resists colonization suggests that the poem resists being owned by any single school of thought. Approaching such a poem, we can feel free to explore, to be fascinated by the unfamiliar. It turns out to be a metaphor that really has legs, that poem resists colonization. I think Calvin should be very proud of having said it. And I think he was talking about appropriation, of the kind you imply by schools of thought. And in a way, he was defending the mysterious, the quiddity, the unique quality of any particular work of art as distinct from an explanation that pretends to be exhaustive. If the work of art is a real work of art, it's never depleted, it's never exhausted. That being is like the culture of a place that resists colonization. To eventually feel at home in it, always allowing the same freedom to other readers. Does this mean the poem is never ours or even the poet's? I would apply the question to the videos at favoritepoem.org. Seth Rodney gives a wonderful reading of Sylvia Plath's Nick and the Candlestick. There's a lot else to be said about that poem. I don't think Seth Rodney thinks he's exhausting the poem. He's not colonizing it. He's reading it. He's experiencing it. And in the video, he opens up to us his experience of it. Pove Chin, when she reads Langston Hughes' Minstrel Man, she doesn't mention that Langston Hughes was African American. She doesn't say anything about the minstrel tradition. She doesn't arrogate or appropriate the poem. She tells you how she feels it's about her experience. And I don't think in either of those cases is another reader, exactly as Kay says, another reader is not being deprived of participating in that poem.
That's all I
have. I can honestly say I've enjoyed this hour. I sometimes found it a little awkward to be waiting for the questions to go through the filter of a keyboard, et cetera, but it felt very worth doing to me. And I'll go so far as to promise that in another iteration of the course, I'll see what we can do to make this even better process. I honestly don't know how much the course materials are going to continue to be available. I will be hoping to keep them available on the web independently of a future reiteration of the art of poetry. And Kay and others, everybody who participated tonight, and everybody who's taken part in the course, I will repeat in 2 words. Thank you.